Hey, Dr. C with you. Let's talk about intermittent fasting. And let's understand types of intermittent fasting for blood sugar control and their benefits and risks. For starters, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the popular types of intermittent fasting. The first one is 16-8, and I'll talk a few that have these different numbers like this to define them. In the case of 16-8, what that means is one is avoiding food for 16 hours and eating within an 8-hour window, thus 16-8. Another popular one is the 5:2 method, 5-2 method. And that basically means one eats normally for 5 days and restricts calories or fasts for 2 days, most commonly some version of caloric restriction. Another one we have is alternate day fasting. This is where you simply don't eat food every other day. And then there's time-restricted feeding. This is where there's a particular window of time in which one is feeding and then not eating during other times. You've got a set period of time in which you'll have all of your meals. For example, like 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Now, the idea here is that there's different things your body does when you're not eating. So your body has lower insulin that it produces. And when you're not making insulin, you can get more sensitized to it. And that's good. When you're more sensitized to it, you need less of it to control your blood sugar. There have been studies showing that intermittent fasting may help lower blood sugar levels, enhance insulin sensitivity, and reduce the risk of type 2 diabetes. There's also the idea about weight loss and then fat reduction. So the thought here is that if you're eating in a narrower window of time, lowering your total food intake especially, intermittent fasting may support weight loss, especially abdominal fat. And then we think about metabolic health. There's been data linking intermittent fasting to improvements in blood pressure, cholesterol levels, and other markers of metabolic health. And then that may tie into cell repair and autophagy. Autophagy is kind of having a moment. It's an exciting sounding word. And yeah, it means we chew up and destroy unhealthy cells. We break down bad cells. And we do more of that when we are undergoing fasting, when the times between food. So the thought here is that if one amplifies this effect, if we do more autophagy, maybe that will lead to better cellular health and longevity. And there's also purported benefits about inflammation. Some research suggests that intermittent fasting can lower inflammatory markers. And that would be a good thing. That would lower the risk of chronic diseases like heart disease and many cancers. And it's also talked about as an idea for weight loss. It appears that intermittent fasting can be an option for weight loss for some people, although group effects show that it may not have advantages over just lowering food intake, simple caloric restriction. So those are the arguments for it. So what are the counter arguments? What could be bad about this? Well, probably the biggest thing to think through is whether these benefits that show up from studies come about because people ate in a certain time or because they lowered their total food intake. And here's the thing, if it really is about eating in a certain time, that's what the intermittent fasting claim is, that the benefits come because we didn't eat for 16 hours in the day. And there have been a lot of studies trying to make this distinction. What they do is they'll have one group of people who lowers their food intake by 25%, one group that lowers their food intake by 25% and only eats within a certain 8-hour window. And then another group that eats within an 8-hour window, but doesn't lower their food intake, right? So we got three things going on. And what these have shown is that those that lower their food intake, regardless of when they're eating their food, they get the same benefits of those who are doing intermittent fasting. And conversely, those who are doing intermittent fasting but fail to lower their food intake, they don't see these benefits show up. So we differentiate the metabolic effects from the behavioral effects. So metabolically, the argument is that if you constrain your food to a certain amount of time, that by itself is helpful. The behavioral effects are that some people who constrain their food to a certain period of time, they end up lowering their food intake. So that was why it helped. It wasn't because they ate in a certain window of time. It was because they lowered their food intake. Now, in some cases, that ends up being a useful way to lower food. There are many people to where if you tell them to eat only from here to here, they'll end up eating less food for a while. And that's totally fine. That's great. But there are those to where they don't, or they don't for as long. Once they get the hang of their certain food window, they end up eating more food during that window and compensating and eating about the same amount of food they did otherwise. And in those cases, intermittent fasting doesn't help. So that's kind of where we are with most of our evidence. It appears that it does help because people lower their food intake, and that by itself often helps just as much anyway. So if it turns out that intermittent fasting causes you to lower your food intake in a way that seems rather painless and in a way that wouldn't have worked as well otherwise, that's probably fine. That's probably great. But if you're someone who does better eating more often throughout the day, you're probably not missing these benefits. It turns out that many of the benefits of autophagy, cellular health, metabolic benefits are more tied to less food and less tied to food timing. Now, there's also some cons about intermittent fasting. So there's evidence that doing so may raise cortisol levels. When that happens, that can worsen the body's stress adaptation. That can cause more muscle loss, more fat retention, disruption of electrolytes. There's also evidence that intermittent fasting can disrupt thyroid hormones, and that can slow the basal metabolic rate. Many studies have shown that fasting in various ways can lower T3 and raise TSH. We've got a lot of that data from studies of Ramadan. So Ramadan is followed by about 1 billion people worldwide. And basically, during about a month, they don't eat food during daylight hours. So they're doing something kind of like intermittent fasting. Now, they're still sleeping at night, but they're really constricting their food intake to a narrow window of time after the sun goes down and before the sun comes up when they're not sleeping their normal amount. And it's been shown pretty clearly that those who follow Ramadan and have thyroid medication they're already taking, they often need dose increases. They become more hypothyroid during the time of persistent intermittent fasting. And then too, we know that there are those to where it can make them not have as good of a relationship with food. Those that have been prone to emotional stress and it affecting their diet or it affecting their food cravings, that can get worse from fasting. Those who have had eating disorders, it's been known that prolonged fasting can cause them to have more binge episode during non-fasting periods. And that can end up leading to more disordered eating overall. And then for appetite, the overall studies have shown that for most participants, intermittent fasting does not have a better effect on appetite than just eating less food. So yeah, if you tell someone only eat during this time or eat less food overall, it's often talked about as if intermittent fasting is a more painless way to lower your food intake. But so far as group effects, it seems not to be the case. Now again, if it's worked for you and it's worked better for you, that's cool. I'm totally behind you. But if you're looking at this saying, will this help me? Is this likely to help me? I've tried a lot of stuff, nothing works. Is this more likely to be useful for me? Our best evidence is that it probably won't be easier than just lowering food longer term overall. Now, another con is possible cardiovascular health. One study showed that those who were restricting their food to an 8-hour window had a 91% higher chance of cardiovascular death, of fatal heart attack. Now, that's a pretty big claim, a big outcome. There is a possible mechanism for that, and that's the cortisol elevation. We know that those that have higher levels of cortisol have more inflammation in their body and more risks for cardiovascular disease. And we know that cortisol is a blood sugar raising hormone. So if one spends large amounts of their day away from food, their blood sugar would run far too low if they didn't make more cortisol to raise it back up again. So this is not definitive, and more studies may or may not verify this finding, but it's plausible. It's possible that one could worsen their cardiovascular health through intermittent fasting. Another concern is hypoglycemia. We think about the signs of hypoglycemia, about dizziness, fatigue, irritability, and those who are more prone to hypoglycemia, they can have problems when they are doing intermittent fasting. I spoke to someone a couple of weeks ago, and she was thankful to me for letting her feel licensed to eat more often again. She had struggled for many years with hypoglycemia, and she had been told that that would improve by intermittent fasting. And she tried many versions of that with healthy food and different protocols, and they always gave her more symptoms of hypoglycemia. She felt just more jittery, more anxious, more out of control for food when she could eat. And she saw some of my videos and read some of my work, and tried eating every 2 to 4 hours again, and making her diet built around healthy, slow-burning carbohydrates, lean proteins, lots of veggies, less saturated fat. And she found that she felt better. Her energy was more stable. She didn't need coffee as badly, and she didn't have such bad out-of-control patterns when she was eating. Her total food intake went down from eating more frequently. Now, that's not true for everyone. There are those to where it seems to help. But when people are looked at as a group, most do better if they're prone to hypoglycemia if they eat more often. So if that's been you and intermittent fasting has not been helpful, know that you're not going to hurt yourself by having food a little more frequently. There's also benefit by having resistant starch in the diet. That's a kind of carbohydrate that burns the most slowly. With intermittent fasting, again, it's important to distinguish between the effects that it has on behavior versus the effects that it has upon metabolism. On behavior, some people stumble onto eating less food, but on metabolism, it doesn't seem to change it in ways that it's talked about. And there's been a lot of excitement about it, mostly because of certain rodent studies. And the tough thing is that, mice, rodents, they respond very differently to dietary change than humans do. Their basal metabolic rate is much faster, and they've got a nocturnal feeding pattern. So when they do intermittent fasting, they can see radical short-term benefits to more autophagy, less inflammation, better regulation of blood sugar. Their metabolism is different, and it affects them quite different than it can for humans. And so far, the human studies suggest that most of the benefits are behavioral when they show up and not as much metabolic. If you are keen to try intermittent fasting, here's some thought processes for you. First off is, start gradually. Choose a window of time that's not too restrictive and phase into that slowly. In terms of times of day, there's more evidence saying that we're probably healthier to eat earlier in the day and, if anything, stop eating in the evening rather than the opposite. So some of the older ideas encourage people to skip breakfast and only eat at lunch or later. But the best evidence we have suggests that if you're going to narrow the window of time in which you're eating, you're probably better off eating breakfast, eating lunch, maybe having an early dinner, and then stopping your eating earlier in the evening rather than avoiding eating in the morning. The idea there is you're getting food in when your body can use it more effectively, and that probably better aligns with the possible benefits of autophagy and cell repair. Think this all through. If intermittent fasting has worked well for you, for your weight, your appetite, your cortisol levels, your thyroid health, and you're doing great overall, that's awesome. Check your health, stay connected with a good practitioner who can help you make sense of your risks. If it's not working well in those various ways, reconsider. The best evidence suggests that you can do just as fine having healthy foods more often. All right, Dr. C with you. Take great care. I'll talk to you again really soon. Bye-bye.